Imagine having the biggest oil treasure on the planet and no one wants to invest in it. Let's talk about Venezuelan oil. On January 3rd, U.S. forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in a game-changing operation. The next day, President Trump was explicit. We are going to have our great oil companies investing billions to fix Venezuela's infrastructure, which is completely destroyed. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, 303 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia and the United States combined. This is a treasure trove for any oil company. So it seems logical to think that the main reason the United States intervened in the Venezuelan government is to gain control of its oil, right? On January 9, at a meeting in the White House, President Trump asked the big oil companies in his country invest $100 billion in Venezuela, rebuild its oil industry. However, the response from the executives present was rather uncomfortable. The CEO of ExxonMobil put it bluntly: Venezuela is not investable in its current state. Not investable?
So, is gaining control of Venezuela's oil the most important reason for the U.S. intervention, or is it not? In this video, we will try to find the answer. We will take a quick look at the history that links the U.S. and Venezuela around oil. And we will discover some current facts that may surprise you. Why? Because there is a neighboring country that changed everything. And because oil is not just about money, it's also about risk. And because we are living history in real time.
Between the 1920s and 1970s, U.S. oil companies invested heavily in Venezuela. At least in terms of oil, this was an era of economic abundance. In 1922, drilling began on the Los Barrosos 2 well. What they found was extraordinary. In just 2 decades, Venezuela became the world's 3rd largest oil producer, after the U.S. and the Soviet Union. By 1929, the change was complete. Venezuela ceased to be an agricultural country and became a petro-nation. Local agriculture was abandoned, imports skyrocketed, and the entire economy began to revolve around black gold. And who was Venezuela's #1 customer at that time? The United States. It was the Golden Age. This created an oil-rich middle class in Venezuela with incredible purchasing power. In 1960, a Venezuelan oil worker earned the equivalent of $117,000 today. They were among the highest paid in the world, and rightly so. And here's the crucial technical detail. U.S. refineries in the Gulf of Mexico were built specifically for heavy Venezuelan crude oil, billions of dollars in specialized infrastructure. In 1960, Venezuela was one of the 5 founding members of OPEC, along with Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait. Oil accounted for 25% of its GDP, more than half of government revenue, and between 80 and 90% of total exports. Venezuela wasn't just rich, it was becoming addicted to oil dollars. But the rules were about to change. The Golden Age was followed by a long period of romance, divorce, and forced reconciliation. Let's try to simplify and summarize. In 1976, President Carlos Andrés Pérez signed a law that completely nationalized the Venezuelan oil industry. PDVSA was born, Petróleos de Venezuela S.A. The new state-owned company would control all of the country's oil. With the stroke of a pen, giants such as Exxon, Gulf, and Mobil lost their concessions. These companies had invested more than $5 billion, and the compensation offered by the Venezuelan government was insignificant. It was barely a fraction of what their assets were worth. Venezuela changed the rules of the game overnight without respecting contracts. This was the first Venezuelan expropriation. Remember this fact because it will be important in our analysis. Despite nationalist rhetoric, the United States continued to buy Venezuelan oil. The same companies that had been expelled continued to operate under service contracts. Both needed each other too much to say goodbye. Venezuela needed technical expertise and access to the U.S. market. The United States needed heavy crude oil. Then, in the 1990s, there was an unexpected twist.
President Carlos Andrés Pérez, the same man who had nationalized the industry, now opened the doors again to foreign investment. They called it La Apertura Petrolera, the oil opening. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips returned, this time to develop the crown jewel, the Orinoco Belt, the largest oil deposit in the world. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Venezuela was exporting between 1.5 and 2 million barrels per day to the United States. It was once again one of its main suppliers. Things seemed to be going well, until Hugo Chavez arrived. Let's talk about the second expropriation. The Chavez government will be remembered for many things, but let's focus on oil. Let's talk about Venezuela's second expropriation. In 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela with a clear rhetoric: anti-imperialist, anti-American, 21st century socialist. His goal was to use oil as a tool for social and political transformation. He called it sowing the oil. And in 2003, workers at PDVSA, the state-owned oil company, went on strike to protest political control of the company. Chavez's response was brutal. He fired 18,000 workers. That was almost half of PDVSA's workforce. They weren't just numbers, they were engineers, geologists, and managers with decades of experience who really knew how the industry worked. It was a massive exodus of talent, a self-inflicted wound from which PDVSA would never recover. But the worst was yet to come. In May 2007, Chavez announced that all foreign oil companies must hand over majority control to PDVSA or leave the country. Chevron, BP, Total, and Statoil agreed to become minority partners, but ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips rejected the terms. In June 2007, the Venezuelan government forcibly took control of those companies' projects. Billions of dollars in investments were confiscated. ExxonMobil sued Venezuela for more than $16 billion. In 2014, the World Bank Arbitration Tribunal awarded it $1.6 billion. ConocoPhillips sued and won an $8.7 billion award in 2019, but Venezuela did not pay. To this day, ConocoPhillips is still trying to collect a debt that now exceeds $12 billion. But the damage went beyond money. The expropriation sent a message to the world. Venezuela does not honor contracts. Venezuela is not trustworthy. Foreign investment stopped. Without the engineers Chavez had fired, without proper maintenance, the oil industry began to collapse. By 2007, Venezuelan production had exceeded 3 million barrels per day. Today, it produces less than 1 million. The infrastructure has not been updated in 50 years. The pipelines are leaking, the processing plants are rusting. And when Nicolás Maduro succeeded Chavez in 2013, things only got worse. But there is a piece of the story that few people know about, and it has to do with Venezuelan assets on U.S. soil. Here is one of the greatest ironies of this story. Venezuela built its own refinery infrastructure on U.S. territory, and there are still million-dollar lawsuits pending. If you drive around the United States, you have probably seen the Citgo logo, gas stations with that red and blue triangle. What you may not know is that Citgo is Venezuelan. In 1986, PDVSA, Venezuela's state-owned oil company, bought 50% of Citgo. In 1990, it bought the other 50% and took complete control of that U.S. company with 3 huge refineries, with a combined capacity of 807,000 barrels per day. And here's the thing, those refineries were specifically designed to process Venezuela's heavy crude oil. The business model was brilliant. PDVSA extracted its own oil, sent it to its own refineries in the United States, and sold the gasoline directly to the end consumer. They practically controlled the entire value chain. It was a sweet deal. But in 2019, when the United States imposed severe sanctions on Maduro's government, everything changed. The Venezuelan opposition, led by Juan Guaidó and recognized by the United States as the legitimate government, appointed a board of directors to protect Citgo. Since then, Citgo has been operating under the control of this opposition board, not Maduro's government.
And in 2024, the final blow came. A U.S. judge ordered the sale of Citgo to pay Venezuela's debts to international creditors, more than $7 billion. The purpose of the court order was to use the money to pay part of the $20 to $30 billion that Venezuela owes to companies and bondholders. But Venezuela rejected the sale and has appealed. The U.S. Treasury has just issued General License 5U, which again delays creditors' ability to enforce PDVSA bonds until March 20, 2026.
But the reality is clear. Venezuela is losing its refineries in the United States, and now its own crude oil cannot even be processed in the facilities they've themselves built. What a metaphor for how these two countries have destroyed their trade relationship. It's time to add more elements to our analysis. If large companies do not want to invest in Venezuela, it is because they prefer to invest in other countries, right? And why does the Trump administration insist that they invest in Venezuela specifically? Let us review the situation of the oil industry in the United States and in the region.
Does Venezuela produce enough oil to make foreign intervention worthwhile?
Venezuela currently produces just under 1 million barrels of crude oil per day. That is barely 1% of global production, very little. In 2007, Venezuela produced around 3 million barrels per day. In other words, today it produces less than a third of that. In 2023, its oil exports generated just $4 billion. Compare that figure with Saudi Arabia, which exported $181 billion.
Venezuela has the largest crude oil reserves in the world, but its industry is so deteriorated that it can barely extract a small fraction and does not have the capacity to refine it locally, so it ends up selling the crude at a discount, mainly to China. And here's the paradox. Since 2007, the United States has managed to implement new technology that allows it to extract oil from deep rock formations on its own territory. This has led them to produce more oil today than any other country in the world, 13.4 million barrels per day, an absolute record. But there is a small technical detail. From these rock formations, the United States extracts light oil.
For 50 years, the United States invested billions of dollars to build highly specialized refineries to process heavy crude oil, which are mainly located on the Gulf Coast. Currently, about 40% of the crude oil refined in the United States is heavy crude. Some of that heavy oil is extracted on U.S. soil, but it is far from sufficient. The United States needs to import about 3 to 4 million barrels of heavy crude oil per day. Venezuela produces exactly the type of heavy oil that the United States needs to import, with the added advantage of being very close to the Gulf Coast refineries. Let's look at other countries that produce heavy oil. The United States imports about 3 million barrels per day of heavy crude oil from Canada. Mexico contributes about 400,000 barrels per day, and Venezuela about 150,000.
In Canada, it is technically feasible to increase heavy crude oil production, which would require investing around $100 billion in new extraction infrastructure. However, another $50 billion would need to be invested to increase the capacity of the pipelines that transport crude oil to the United States. An investment of this magnitude has been highly questioned due to uncertainty surrounding regulatory and environmental factors. In addition, competition from other producing regions keeps the sale price low. The low price and regulatory uncertainty discourage investment.
Mexico exports its crude oil to the United States, but then has to import refined products, such as gasoline, resulting in a negative trade balance. In other words, Mexico has to import more and at a higher price than it exports. This has been discouraging crude oil exports, favoring investment in local refineries.
Mexico prefers to refine locally in order to meet domestic demand without having to import. In addition, Mexican heavy crude oil requires more processing, which makes it cheaper on the world market. This discourages investment in exploration and extraction. So, Mexico faces strong pressure to reduce its exports and reorient them toward domestic consumption, and it has been reducing them.
Other countries in the region that produce heavy oil are Colombia and Ecuador. But like Mexico, both have been reducing their production due to a lack of incentives to invest. Therefore, investing in extracting more heavy crude oil in the region does not seem to be very profitable or very safe. This could explain why large industries in the United States are not very eager to invest. So why does Trump insist? Let's talk about Mexico and the energy risk. We have already seen why Mexico is being forced to reduce its volume of heavy crude exports, and it will continue to do so. What will happen then in the United States? This will not be a good scenario for U.S. refineries. It is true that they can import crude oil from other countries, such as Brazil or the Middle East, but competition is extremely fierce, especially with China. In addition, transportation costs are rising, and they need to use less secure routes. And how does the Trump administration interpret the scenario of reduced imports from Mexico? The government is likely under pressure from refining companies. But more importantly, the government is interpreting this scenario as a real increase in energy security risk. The Trump administration has defined as one of its priorities supporting supply chains to make them more predictable, encouraging investment in those supply chains that feed defense systems, energy infrastructure, advanced manufacturing, and emerging technologies. Both Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Vice President J.D. Vance have expressed this on several occasions. Venezuela then emerges as an interesting option for reducing this energy risk. Diverting Venezuela's exports to China to the United States would greatly help to reduce the risk, about 750,000 barrels per day. But that is not enough. To reduce energy risk, it is necessary to have a stable and reliable partner.
But what do Venezuelans gain from that? These are business. Both sides should win. The United States needs a long-term partner. Receiving an investment of several billion dollars annually could mean the difference between total collapse and economic recovery for Venezuela. And the United States could thus gain a happy, grateful, and reliable partner. Now, every oil company needs to invest in order to grow. If oil companies don't want to invest in Venezuelan heavy crude, where are they investing? To answer that question, we need to talk about light oil. Let's talk about Guyana, Venezuela's small neighbor. Guyana is the elephant in the room. Guyana is a small country, about the size of Idaho, with 800,000 inhabitants. It is the only English-speaking country in South America. Until a decade ago, it was one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. But everything changed in 2015. ExxonMobil announced the discovery of the Liza-1 field in the Stabroek Block, 200 kilometers off the coast. What they found was extraordinary, more than 90 meters of high-quality sandstone saturated with oil. And since then, they have made more than 30 additional discoveries. Guyana's proven reserves are more than 11 billion barrels, and they keep finding more.
And here comes the really impressive part: speed. In the oil industry, it can take a decade to go from discovery to production. But ExxonMobil did it in Guyana in just 4 years. It is the fastest offshore development in modern history, a true world record. Today, just 6 years after starting production, Guyana produces 900,000 barrels per day. Venezuela produces 1 million after 100 years. By 2027, Guyana will produce 1.3 million barrels per day. By 2030, 1.7 million. It will be the second largest producer in South America after Brazil. Guyanese crude oil sells for between $70 and $80 per barrel. Premium price. Meanwhile, Venezuelan crude oil sells for around $60. There is just one small problem: the type of oil that Guyana produces. While Venezuela has heavy crude oil, which is difficult and expensive to process, Guyana has light, sweet crude oil. It does not need diluents to be transported. It does not need costly processes to refine it. Any standard refinery can handle it. And this is the information that changes everything: the equilibrium price. Producing oil in Venezuela using existing infrastructure costs around $40 to $50 per barrel. But for new projects with new infrastructure, the cost could rise to $80. In Guyana, on the other hand, developing new fields costs just $30 per barrel. The math is simple. Investing in new infrastructure in Venezuela makes no economic sense. Let's leave the numbers aside so we don't get confused. The most profitable and lowest risk new extraction projects for oil companies are those involving light crude in Guyana. Even if the global price of crude oil falls in the future, Guyana's wells will continue to be a money-making machine. At the other end of the spectrum, new heavy crude extraction projects are not profitable. The investment required is too high, resulting in production costs that exceed the sale price.
On the other hand, there are projects already established in Venezuela which have already paid for their investment, those that are already producing. These have a medium financial risk. If the market price falls, these operations could earn very little money or stop earning altogether. Large exploration and extraction companies are looking to invest in new projects more similar to those in Guyana, not Venezuela.
So, financially speaking, it's not worth investing in new projects in Venezuela. Exactly. Currently, it doesn't make sense to invest in new infrastructure. It's simply too expensive to be viable. So, what alternatives are there for Venezuelans? The most profitable thing in Venezuela is to carry out small projects that seek to optimize current production. These are profitable projects, but small ones, marginal projects. In other words, projects that require less investment and seek to slightly reduce production costs or slightly increase production volume. But there is an intermediate alternative that would require more investment and therefore more risk. Upgrade and repair part of the infrastructure that Venezuela already has, but is in disuse. In theory, the investment required is less than the option of installing a whole new infrastructure, but it is a risky move. It may not be feasible to return to producing 3 million barrels per day, but they could produce 2 million. Those who invest in this option will be betting on profits that are significantly lower than those they would obtain in Guyana. And the profit could disappear if the world market price of oil falls. It is time to try to answer the main question. We have already reviewed the main background information. Now we can better understand Trump's meeting with the oil companies. Trump asks the executives present, rebuild Venezuela's oil industry. But comparing this project with those already underway in Guyana, the executives see a business with low profitability and high risk. They see Venezuela as a country where there is no legal certainty or political stability, and they see a government that has already seized their investments twice and refuses to pay what it owes.
After the meeting, Trump was clear. If large companies do not want to invest in Venezuela, we will offer the business to smaller companies that are willing to take the risk. So everything seems to indicate that the future of the Venezuelan oil industry will depend on the guarantees that the parties can offer. Those who invest will demand guarantees that protect them from being expropriated. And there will probably be agreements with the United States to ensure a minimum price for crude oil for a certain period. And it seems likely that we will see new negotiations on the future of Citgo.
But anyway, let's try to answer our question. Is oil the main reason for the United States' intervention in the Venezuelan government? The answer, like almost everything in geopolitics, is complex and multifaceted. There is no single truth, but rather several layers of possible motivations that we must consider. Let's list some motivations that could explain the intervention in Venezuela from the point of view of its oil.
First, the real economic interests of the private sector. Yes, it exists. U.S. refineries need heavy crude oil. This could generate significant benefits for some states, although marginal at the national level. The U.S. will not collapse without Venezuelan oil, but the opportunity is there. Then there is the U.S. interest in reducing energy risk. Exports from Mexico and other crude oil-producing countries in the region are falling, while Canada would require too high an investment. Here, Venezuela could be the best option. It is even possible to optimize current production without major investments.
Then we have geopolitical interests. Could the main objective be to diminish the influence of China and Russia in the region? Or is it a projection of power to establish that the United States can and will act in its neighborhood? Then we have drug trafficking. Could oil be just a consequence of the US plan to end drug trafficking? This could also make sense. Let's remember that Maduro was captured because he was wanted on drug trafficking charges in the Southern District of New York. The post-Maduro situation created a window of opportunity, and Trump took advantage of it. Stabilizing Venezuela's politics and economy could be part of a plan to eliminate organized crime in the region. Helping Venezuela recover its oil industry could be an effective weapon to impose certain conditions on the Venezuelan government in return.
And of course, we must consider the existential benefit for Venezuela. Here, the equation can change completely. The difference between producing 1 million versus 2 million barrels per day is the difference between total collapse and a possible economic recovery. Billions of additional dollars for a bankrupt country is transformational. For Venezuela, this is literally life or death. It seems to me that oil is a secondary objective, not the main driver of this intervention. But it is a very important objective. It can be the foundation that supports the main objective. It supports political stability in the region, makes the region safer, and reduces interference from other powers. And, incidentally, it helps reduce the energy risk of the United States.
What do you think? Was oil the main motivation for the Trump administration's intervention in Venezuela? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you think it was just about oil? What do you think was the main reason? If you've made it this far, remember to leave a like and share this video.